Hello and welcome to Mema's conversation with Professor Mark Ayyesh on navigating Palestine in a post-BLM world. My name is Naseem Ahmed. I am an analyst and a writer for the Middle East Monitor, and I will be your host for this event. As you would have seen, the death of George Floyd just over 2 months ago sparked protests across his hometown in Minneapolis and around major cities across the world. These mainly peaceful protests inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement, put the topic of police brutality and more broadly the subject of racism at the center of public discourse. Very quickly, parallels were drawn between the plight of the Palestinians and the legacy of racism in the US and elsewhere. So to discuss the significance of this moment, particularly in combating racism suffered by Palestinians, I am joined by a professor of sociology at Mount Royal University in Canada, Mark Ayyesh. Thank you, Mark, for joining us.
Thank you, Naseem. I really appreciate this opportunity to have a conversation with you here today. And thanks to the Middle East Monitor for making this happen.
You're welcome. Mark, so I'd like to begin by asking, as a Palestinian and an academic in Canada, can you share your immediate reaction to the wave of protests following the death of George Floyd?
Yes, so I'll start with my immediate reaction following the news of the death of George Floyd. This is prior to the protest, but just simply when that news came out and we watched that video, the immediate reaction was anger, frustration, hopelessness. Here we go again, another Black man murdered by the state, and the belief that I had with many other people, I think at the time, that, well, nobody's going to be held responsible for this. This is just going to keep on happening because that is the internal structural racism within the US is so embedded that this has been happening for decades and decades and nothing has been done about it. So that was my immediate reaction, was all those feelings of anger and frustration and hopelessness. But then the protests came, and that was the protests were an expression of all of those feelings that I think a lot of people shared. But the protests also added the feelings of inspiration as well. So my immediate reaction from seeing the protests was to feel that all of those initial reactions and emotions that I had were expressed for me on the social landscape. But the protests themselves added inspiration. They added hope. They added an element of resistance and potentially even hopefully a revolution of the social and political and judicial system that has taken many Black lives over decades and decades and decades and hundreds of years. So that was sort of my immediate reaction to the protests and their spread in the United States.
Yes. Yeah. So as I mentioned, very quickly, parallels were drawn between structural racism within the US and elsewhere, of course, within Palestine. So I wanted to ask him, why is there such a deep bond between the BLM and the Palestinian cause? What do you put this down to?
Yes, so BLM itself, when it emerged in the around 2014, 2013, 2014, was always from the beginning strong in its support for Palestinian liberation. And I think that's due to a couple of reasons. First, there has been, since at least the 1960s, a close connection between Black liberation struggle and the Palestinian liberation struggle. They've had close connections since at least the 1960s, 1970s. And I think that connection lies in a philosophy of anti-racism and anti-imperialism. So it's particularly, if you're looking at why is BLM interested in the Palestinian struggle, it is because of its anti-imperialist emphasis. And why is the Palestinian struggle interested in the Black liberation struggle? Is because of the anti-racism emphasis that is embedded within the Palestinian struggle as well. So that relationship goes back for decades. But certainly with BLM, it seems to have taken on a more explicit form. And I do think that one of the key aspects here in terms of the connection is not necessarily the specific details in terms of how oppression is experienced by these communities, because that's different. The experiences of the Black communities in the US and their experiences of oppression is very different than the ones that Palestinians have faced and continue to face. But I do think that they both have faced on a fundamental level what it means and what a sort of life that is lived under the threat of sort of unchecked state violence. When state violence attacks certain racialized bodies with almost no consequence whatsoever, the experience of those who face that kind of violence creates an intimate kind of solidarity between them and a kind of shared experience in a kind of abstract sense through which they can connect. And people may talk about, oh, well, there was consequences for this or that police officer or this or that soldier, but that's not really consequences for the state. That's state violence itself and how it is unleashed on those communities. It has faced no consequences whatsoever for the unleashing of that violence. So I think that is ultimately the sort of tie between those communities that for me speaks to the kind of solidarities that we see emerge between them.
So for sure, I mean, this seems to be a kind of a watershed moment with respect to fighting racism. But do you really think this is as significant as many people suggest it is? And how would you assess? I mean, it's only been, 2013, 2014, so it's only been 5 years since the emergence of BLM as a movement, anti-racism movement. So how would you assess the impact in challenging structural racism? It's probably too early to tell, but how would you assess that impact? And more specifically in the case of the Palestinians, who, as we know, have a long history of living under Israeli occupation. Do you think, politically and culturally things have shifted and BLM will push this and drive this agenda much better and further than anything we've seen recently?
Well, so as you mentioned in the question itself, it is difficult to assess the impact within such a short time. To give you an example of why it's so difficult, in March, people would have said BLM is a failure, right? BLM didn't go away after Ferguson and all of the other protests that they've had over the last 5 or so years. But people thought, well, they're on the fringes of American politics and that movement has, or that, or as an organization, as a movement, as part of the anti-racism movement, it's kind of fizzled out. I would guarantee you that you'll find lots of people saying that precise same thing back in March. And none of those people are saying that now. Because it's very difficult to judge the impact of social movements because they go through such ups and downs. But certainly since these latest protests, I think they have attained a certain kind of status within the social and political discourse and the landscapes that it's not going to be as easy to brush them aside as it was prior to this moment. So I am hopeful that these events have created a kind of momentum for BLM that their impact will continue to grow, hopefully. But it is very difficult to assess where it's going to lead us. But one thing we do know is that they're not going to stop. They haven't stopped since 2014 when they were sort of pushed to the side, and they're not going to stop now. So I think there is momentum being built.
So, I mean, if I could kind of rephrase that question, I mean, what would you say to some of the critics who've come out and said that, if BLM was more laser focused with Black Lives Matter, more specifically, without burdening itself with another, goal, which is freedom for Palestinians, which has led to backlash here in the UK and in the US, accusations of anti-Semitism. and many groups have, some groups have pulled their support. So I think, do you think they would achieve more success by being more laser focused with the BLM issue and abstaining from the Palestinian cause, or do you think they are so ideologically wedded that without fighting racism in Palestine, you cannot really address racism anywhere? As the saying goes, you know, to fight injustice anywhere is to fight injustice everywhere. So how do you see that?
Well, okay, so for me, as I see it, BLM is not just wedded to the Palestine cause. It is wedded as well with indigenous activism in the U.S. It is wedded with all sorts of other struggles for peace and justice. So there are many debates that go on within these movements of how to keep the focus on this particular topic without getting into too many other sort of distractions. And these debates are ongoing, and I'm not privy to those from within BLM. But what I can say for your question is that from the perspective of Palestinians who are in solidarity with BLM, it is critical that we also don't lose sight of their main concern, which is Black lives within the US and within Canada, depending on which BLM, or within the UK. So solidarity means not to just kind of jump onto their popularity in order to push your own cause. Solidarity means standing side by side with these activists in their efforts to improve their lives, learning from them, supporting them when you can, and then they do the same to you in your struggle. To me, that's what the more sort of constructive forms of solidarity that you see within BLM in the Palestinian struggle. And there has been many examples of that working in that way. So we have to be careful not to speak of, not to sort of hijack BLM for your own purposes, but to stand in solidarity with them, support them, and learn from them as they do the same with you. You know, when you talk about these movements, whether it's indigenous activism or Black Lives Matter or Palestinian liberation, you have to understand that you are talking here about oppressed groups who are facing extremely powerful forces that are oppressing them and trying to continue that oppression. And in those struggles, the world will feel lonely, it will feel terrifying, it will feel depressing, it will feel hopeless. And these solidarities can sometimes provide inspiration to keep going, and to push yourself forward in ways that can't be underestimated. And I think BLM has done that, has provided that inspiration in these latest protests to a lot of movements, not just the Palestine liberation cause. Just for example, the Washington football team. I mean, indigenous activists have been fighting against that for years and years and years. It is arguable that the BLM created an atmosphere where that pressure it allowed for that pressure to be exerted in a stronger way, and that led to the Washington football team dropping its racist name. Yeah. So there are all sorts of dynamics that BLM has created, and whether they know it or not, or whether they're trying to or not, they're not just helping the Black communities in the U.S., which they are doing, but they're also helping others as well, which is again a source of inspiration and hope for all of us.
Yeah, I think one of the impacts, I would say, culturally at least, is what we've seen over the last 2-3 weeks. I'm thinking of prominent American academics like Peter Beinart and Canadian actor Seth Rogen. You know, both over the last 2 weeks made shockwaves in their own way, with statements that, you know, we could describe as some kind of a political conversion. Beinart, for example, he turned his back on a two-state solution and said that he was now a one-stater. To me, that is for me, that could be seen as a sign of BLM really asking difficult questions. Especially to liberal Jews. So do you think BLM is kind of putting a mirror in front of liberal Jews and to look at the occupation and the structural racism under which Palestinians live for such a long time? Do you think there is a kind of a cause and it's put a mirror in front of liberal Jews?
Well, again, it is difficult to answer these questions in a definitive way, but I do believe that BLM has created a political environment where people are asking themselves tougher questions than they've asked before. I mean, let's not forget, you know, for me, for you, for many of the viewers, racism in its existence is not a controversial issue. We know it's there. But for many of the majority, to actually make them face the fact that they live in a racist society was quite an accomplishment. Sad of a commentary as that is, it is actually quite an accomplishment. So it has made people look in the mirror in a more reflexive way. So in that kind of environment, you could easily argue that the likes of Beinart and Rogan did start to take a harder look at themselves and what their sort of ideology says or has to say about Palestinians in a way that maybe they did not before. But I would like to raise a point of caution here. As people were paying a lot of attention to Beinart and Rogan, the Democratic platform under Biden for Israel-Palestine is exactly the same as it was under the Obama administration. And that was devastating for Palestinians. The Obama administration was just as devastating for Palestinians as is the Trump administration. The Democratic Party platform, if Biden wins, will not be welcomed news for the Palestinians. Their dispossession, their expulsion, their murder, that will all continue to happen with explicit U.S. support. So I think we need to keep our eyes on the ball here and yes, welcome these transformations for these individuals. And of course, when you're talking about Beinart changing and Rogan changing, there's obviously other people that we don't know about that are changing as well. So I'm not saying this is nothing, but we're still a long way away from changing U.S. policy here. So we still have a long way to go on this.
Yeah, that's yes, but to me, what you've just described within the Democratic Party and the platform they've adopted, which we can say is kind of anti-Palestinian, it's not really that much better than the Republicans, to be honest. But that speaks to a wider cultural tension between politicians in the US and many liberal Jews. And for me, it shows is an indication that there will be a greater rift between even liberal politicians and Jewish communities, especially liberals. So I think this cultural tension would play out in the coming years. And the Democrat itself will have to ask hard questions. If you have more and more politicians, the like of Ilhan Omar or Cortez being elected, I think you may even see what we see in the UK, a major existential crisis within the Democrats, as we see within the Labour Party. Do you see that kind of playing out within American politics in the coming years?
Yes, I mean, that's already happening. Cory Bush, who just won last night the primary in Missouri. Cory Bush was a BLM organizer and central activist in Ferguson. And she is openly speaking about Palestinian rights. I believe she even supports BDS, and she just won a primary against the Democratic incumbent, I believe he was the incumbent, who tried to attack her on the issue of BDS in Israel towards the end of the campaign to try to salvage his campaign, and it didn't work. She still won. So I bring up Cory Bush for two reasons. First, it shows again that solidarity between BLM and the Palestine struggle, and also it shows how that has now entered. Well, if she wins the Senate race, I believe she's running for Senate. If I'm not wrong, I could be wrong about that. It's either Congress or Senate. I'm not sure, but anyway, if she does win in a heavily blue district, I believe, so she has a good chance of winning. So we see how that's becoming institutionalized as well in a certain way. So the potential election of Cory Bush would be a sign of what you're describing happening. because a lot of the liberal Jewish population supports Cori Bush. If not now, independent Jewish voices and many other groups support Cori Bush and other progressive politicians who speak about Palestinian rights. Politicians like Ilhan Omar as well. So that is certainly happening. I just want to raise the caution of let's not celebrate this too quickly. It's still a long way to go. And the progressive Democrats, the squad is how many people? It's not that many people yet. Yeah. So it's growing, and I'm supporting it, but I'm just cautious.
Yeah,
We've been stung by the U.S. many times.
I think let's shift our focus slightly on to Israel. I mean, we've touched on it just before. BLM has been met with strong resistance, mainly from the political right, and also pro-Israeli groups have also tried to discredit the movement as anti-Semitic, here in the UK in particular. To me, this is strikingly at odds with positive role which Jewish leaders throughout history have played in advancing progressive cause such as BLM. I'm thinking, the role played in bringing down apartheid South Africa, and also the US civil rights movement, where Jewish leaders played a major role. I mean, what does it say to you now? What does it say to you that Israel and many pro-Israeli groups are now so opposed to the BLM and see BLM as almost kind of an existential threat, completely at odds with the role many Jewish leaders would have played in progressive movements over the past? What does it say about Israel to you?
Right. So just to start off with this comment, of course, the Jewish community is not a monolith. So you have all sorts of political divisions within that community, whether it's in the UK or the States or Canada or wherever else. And there are certain Jewish groups, like I just said, independent Jewish voices, for example, or if not now, who are strong supporters of BLM and continue to carry out that support and that struggle, and they speak for Palestinian rights. We may have disagreements over some of the phrasings and all of that, but there's still these groups that do a lot of good work. And even when you talk about the apartheid, during apartheid in South Africa, Israel was a supporter of the apartheid regime, while many Jewish groups and communities were opposed to it. On principled grounds. So these divisions are not new, and they've been around for a while. And I think one of the main reasons why you see, for example, Israel as a country now, as a state, opposing BLM and other such movements is precisely because they're anti-imperialist and anti-racist as well. But Israel is part and parcel of American neo-colonialism or imperialism, whatever term you prefer, and therefore any anti-imperial ideology is opposed to it as far as it's concerned. So it's not really a surprise at all when I hear that Israel is opposed to an ideology like BLM or the anti-imperialist Black liberation movements that we've seen in history, or any other indigenous activists who are anti-imperialists and anti-colonialists. Are also opposed by the Israeli state. So it's not that shocking of a thing for me to see that, and it's also not shocking of a thing for me to see all those other Jewish progressive groups fighting for all of these anti-imperial and anti-racist causes.
I mean, lastly, just before we finish, going forward. Thinking about the two formulas of resolution for the Palestinian conflict, one state, two state. Do you see signs of BLM's influence on this debate? I mean, some will say that, Bainat coming out as a one state following BLM's protest isn't just a mere coincidence. Do you think more and more Palestinians are beginning to reframe their movement less as a national liberation struggle and more as a kind of a civil rights movement, seeking equal justice, equal rights under a single state? I mean, you're a Palestinian. Is that something you consider now? And do you think more and more Palestinians will jump on this one state vision?
Yes, I mean, so the one state vision has been around for quite some time. You can argue since the even 1920s in certain versions.
Yeah.
Of course, we don't have enough time to go through all of the different iterations of what two states and one states models there are out there. And I can tell you there are some models of two states that sound better to me than some models of one states. So it depends on the substance of what people put forward underneath those titles. But more or less, one state that would actually have equal status, equal rights, equal citizenship, equal access to the land, to resources, all of those things would be something that I would favor, and that many Palestinians would favor. At least, it's very difficult to get an accurate a picture of what people on the ground might say about this. But again, a lot of the polls that are out there are not that good when it comes to this, because the questions are phrased badly, and so it's complicated to get a good picture of what ordinary Palestinians might say about this. I certainly support it. Many intellectuals support it. Many activists support it, and equally, many Jewish progressives support it. Within Israel, there's not a lot of support from Israelis for that idea, and the proof of that is in. You don't even need to look at the polls in election results. People they vote for are for one state, but one state that expels Palestinians and destroys Palestine. So to bring it back to BLM, I'm not so sure that on the specifics of this question that you can find a lot of impact from BLM. I think again the impact of BLM goes into the political environment that they have created, in which people are asking tough questions of themselves, which might explain, for example, the conversion, if you will, of a Beinart, or well, Seth Rogen doesn't talk about this, but of Beinart. So, just to kind of wrap it up on this in terms of one state, two state. Even if the odds are against, a lot of the sort of criticism of one state is that it's too, utopian and blah, blah, blah.
So with the two-state, many would say it's utopian. It's
that's what I was going to say. Is it's actually the two-state that's the utopian vision. This is much more realistic to achieve. And the focus, the highlighting anti-racism within that is something that has been around for a while, but it has been stressed, I would agree, more and more by the younger generation of scholars writing about Palestine and writing about the struggle.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of our time, actually. So I want to thank you, Mark, for joining us for this conversation, and I want to thank our audience who are tuning in to listen. So hope to see you next time in another conversation with Memo. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.